What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? Acronator here, and welcome to another week of Overwatch case review, case study, whatever the hell I call this thing. If you follow me on Twitter, you would have seen that this episode is going to be a day late. Actually, I'm recording it later on Wednesday night, which will be yesterday as of this releasing, just because Tuesday I got completely fucked up with overtime at work and family stuff, and Monday was just a complete no-go because I got caught up in League Zero stuff. So either way, we're now here with this. Despite a lot of shit happening in the Overwatch League this past weekend, actually some interesting matches, and I believe Chinese contenders, something like that, especially in the APAC side of things for the Overwatch League anyways. I wanted to cover this match in particular because if you've read the title, you'll know that Paris Eternal played a lot of weird things. Like, they didn't completely shy away from playing this rush composition that you see the Uprising playing here, but they really didn't play this composition, which seems to be like the standout meta, unless they absolutely had to. Like, I think they played it up against the Gladiators briefly, but otherwise, like, they didn't really pull it out too much. They didn't look incredible on it either. I believe they struggled with that the previous week, and I think they went like, what, 2-2, and just barely missed out on the qualifying rounds. Either way, this map in particular, Volskaya, from the match against the Uprising, I found to be really interesting because not only did they play a lot of compositions that just felt completely like out of left field, especially on, I believe, their defense, where they just like pulled something out of their ass. It might have actually been on their second point offense. I'll have to watch through it. It's been a couple days, almost almost a week now, 6 days since this match was played, but I knew I wanted to cover this the second I saw it, just because it's really fascinating. And the quick answer is no, the Paris Eternal did not define or break the meta or whatever, but it definitely goes to show that really any composition is viable at like the... Okay, I want to be careful with saying that, because like in the level of play that I'm most commonly accustomed with, say like the community level of play, right? It can even go up to like mid GM in terms of community level, but even then, like, composition doesn't really matter until you get to like the contenders trials level. That's what I've told a lot of teams whenever I coach them, that they're, obsessing like, oh, this is the meta. It's like, look, play what you're good at, play your win conditions, you'll be fine, right? And once you get to like the actual professional level, there's actual not necessarily a hard defined meta, because we've seen multiple teams in the past defy the meta and do really well. Obviously, this game against the Paris Eternal, this game against the Uprising, we are covering the Paris Eternal, went the distance, went like, I believe, to map 5, and they ended up winning it in the very, very, very end. But even then, we've had like Season 2 Chengdu Hunters, who pulled out the Wrecking Ball composition to like mixed success, but the fact that they were getting any success was a decent amount of talking points. So anyways, yeah, I'm just going to let this play out for now. Actually, skip ahead a little bit to when the game actually starts, to see what the Paris Eternal actually run out on. And I'll go over like their plan, what they want to do here. So they're playing the Wrecking Ball composition. We've seen this kind of like go by the wayside as the June Joust progressed over the course of like late May into the qualifiers, mostly because we saw like mostly double shield, double bubble, and then this like monkey rush composition, I guess we can call it. It's not really a dive, although it's kind of played like a dive. It's more played like a brawl composition, in all honesty, which is ironic. Most compositions nowadays that are popular in the Overwatch League and like pro, contenders-ish level seem to be more like rush compositions. Everything just goes back to the good old days of GOATs, I guess, where rush was maybe not completely grandfathered in, but like where it really captured the attention of the broader community. So anyways, they're playing this Wrecking Ball composition. It's more or less what I like to call the divide and conquer composition, where they really just want to use Don and Naga to displace someone on the Uprising. In this case, probably going to be like Myongbong or IM37. Granted, everyone on the Uprising has a decent amount of not necessarily movement abilities, but in a way movement abilities to get out of situations. And then from that disruption, the rest of the core of the Paris Eternal, meaning Oni God. Vestola, Dridro, and Khan, side note, these two, despite being relatively new to the Eternal, actually played really well this past weekend. Despite them not obviously qualifying for anything, at the end of the day, they did really well. Especially considering like Elifo was one of the better players on the Eternal. But that's neither here nor there, however. So that's basically the essential components of this composition, the Wrecking Ball composition that Paris wants to play. Divide and conquer. These two go off, do their own thing, and then reconvene with the other four to cause chaos. Unfortunately for... Okay, no, they actually swapped a little bit. Okay, so they immediately go to this not Wrecking Ball, Roadhog composition. So this changes... I for some reason forgot that they almost immediately swapped to it and found a good amount of success. For some reason I thought it was later in the map that they swapped to it. So this changes things up a little bit because Roadhog is probably the only tank in the game that I would personally consider like a hybrid tank, where he can fill the role of the main tank just because of the presence that he demands. He's an extremely high damage and high value tank, and as a result of that, he is coincidentally capable of taking a lot of space, meaning that in this case Don, while he obviously doesn't have a shield or anything to protect him, he doesn't have the movement of Wrecking Ball, he is going to play the role of the main tank still. Whereas the rest of the team kind of has to play around him, and what they're going to be looking for is someone on the uprising out of position. They hook him, whoever that be, on the uprising. In this case, they're probably going to be looking for like IM37, Valentine, Myeonbong, maybe Faith. The tanks are going to be a little bit harder, but like whoever gets hooked needs to die almost instantaneously, and that's going to be a big challenge for the DPS of the Paris Eternal. So because they're playing this so early, I was going to wait until the swap happened, and that happened a lot sooner than I was expecting. We're going to watch Don because that's really going to be the win condition of this composition. Like, there can be pokes, yeah, Onigod can find like flanks or whatnot, but it's really going to be dependent on these hooks. Already you have a really quick hook onto stand 1. You could see that, I'm not even going to pause that, I'm just going to slow it down a little bit. You could see that, like I said, it's going to be a lot harder to capitalize on it, but you can see the insane amount of burst damage. Like if I go back just briefly, and you can watch stand 1's health, they didn't know who was being hooked, they just knew that someone was being hooked. So the defense matrix comes in, and even despite that, when you look at stand 1's HP, puts up the bubble, so that's already gone, there's half his health. Instantaneous. Now imagine if that was a DPS or a support that Don had hooked. In this case, he has hook up once again. He actually hooks Gabolshi in this time around. Once again, half HP. Would have been a lot more effective if he could have hooked someone else, but the tanks just happened to be in the front and they were really looking for anything. Here you actually have Onigod finding an early pick. Granted, Onigod, like, not carried, but like he really performed out of his mind. Like the entirety of Paris was playing really well. So where does he find Faith? Because this is really his job, is like melt whoever's being hooked, but when the hooks don't land, it's Onigod's job to find picks like this. Okay, so that was just Faith trying to peel for Gabolshi to make sure he doesn't get team-mech'd, but Onigod just playing out of his goddamn mind. And that's probably going to be, yep, Valentine dying. That's Naga's job as well, just to find picks when the hooks don't land. I was going to go back over to Don, but that didn't last very long. And despite losing Don, their main tank, by this point they were up like, what, 2 or 3 people? I think they were up two people by the time Don had died. And even then, when you look at who had been lost, you lost Valentine, which is a huge source of spam damage. You lost your main support, so that's basically all of your peel. Gable, she was just about to be demeched. So you have basically no peel whatsoever if you're the uprising, and Paris were all completely focused onto just one target. So that really allowed them to secure that point, especially considering that Paris had the spawn advantage. Going back over to Don, just because, again, he's going to be the initiator in most of these cases. Now that Naga's using his duplicate onto Gabolshi, that's going to be a little bit of an initiation. What the fuck was this hook? I remember seeing that on the stream. I think they showed it in replay, or maybe they just happened to be spectating Don here, but like, what is this hook? Hooked his wing, I think. But that's exactly what you need to do, and here you have the Uprising honestly making a reasonable play. They had to equalize there, because they lost a huge source of damage. Especially because Valentine, when you look at it, was very close to duplicate, so what they were probably trying to do was initiate onto Coalescence and then build up Duplicate and use that. But that now gone. They used that opportunity because Don doesn't have Hook. He can't punish anyone in the back line as easily. However, Parrish just entirely turned around. Everyone besides Don immediately turned around and just focused hard in onto the uprising. I believe Myunbong died mid Coalescence, and yeah, that's literally 5 minutes. Like, Paris gained 57 seconds from start to end of that entire round, which is utterly ridiculous. And I hope you can understand a little bit more of like how that composition is supposed to be played. It's very methodical. It's literally just playing around hook cooldowns, and if the DPS can find any lucky picks, then you go for that. But they also need to play very safe. Like, you saw that Onigad and Naga were never positioning in a way that was overly aggressive. They weren't trying to set the win conditions. They were more so like waiting for the uprising to make a mistake, and it was more on the tanks of Eternal, mostly Don, to force out mistakes from really anyone in the uprising to allow for Onigad and Naga to find these picks. So skipping ahead, now of course on defense they're going for this double shield, although they're not holding the high ground, which is a little bit weird compared to what we've seen like the uprising do in the past. Now we have the uprising ironically not even playing the rush composition anymore. It looks like they're playing the super monkey ball. No, okay, they're going immediately back to the rush. I think they were scouting it out. Okay, so now I'll pause it real briefly because again, this is more like not exactly meta, but it's closer to the meta that we've seen that was developing briefly prior to Double Bubble and eventually this rush composition becoming more popular. Ironically, though, when you have a good team versus a good team with double shield versus the rush, I've noticed that the double shield tends to win out. I believe it was the Atlanta Reign versus San Francisco Shock game that won Atlanta their ticket to Hawaii. That actually showcased that quite a bit because Atlanta was really good at the double shield. It was a meta that really fit them, but more than that, they just kind of popped off at the right time, and that's really all it takes at the end of the day to get those qualifications, whereas the Shock definitely tried to force the rush composition a little bit more than what was probably possible. I believe even like last week at some point, I forget. No, last week I did. Last week I did Aspire for Toronto, I think. Yeah, so I think it was 2 weeks ago where I covered like the double bubble versus the double shield, and I think it was on like Hollywood and trying to explain like, okay, well, I think it was even Paris, it might have been like London, who was like struggling to hell and back to try and dislodge the double shield with like the monkey and everything. It just didn't work. And generally, as long as you can play the poke game correctly, with the double shield, you can probably win that matchup pretty well. So in this case, it's really just going to be poking out as much as possible, which is a little bit weird as to why, again, why they didn't decide to hold up on the high ground. Instead, they held like right here. What it does do, however, is it takes a lot of focus off of Onigad, so maybe that was the plan from the beginning. It's just like, don't bunker. That was a nasty shot. Onigad really came alive in this round in particular. I don't think they get first held uprising, but I believe they get first point like rather late, and then they get second held. I think that happened like twice. And more or less, this is going to be a little bit more standard, aside from like the position that they're holding. Again, like normally double shield and really any bunker composition, which pretty much always focuses around Orisa, you'd be up on the high ground because you can't really take high ground. You can't really deal with someone else on the high ground as the double shield, and you want to poke out for as long as possible, right? Because you can't really do much when someone's right on top of you. You saw there was a decent amount of struggle trying to keep Vistola alive. I believe he even died, and they just had to use res to bring him back up after the fight. It's very difficult to kind of deal with anyone when they're right on top of you when you're playing the double shield, especially when you're playing the Sigma with it, as opposed to like the Divor. You have a little bit more sustainability close range. Like you'll notice, say on like Lijiang Tower Control Center, most teams will run the Rein Zarya just so they can get really brawly, whereas the occasional team, maybe if their off tank is more comfortable with it, will run the Sigma, and they like to kite a little bit more, play a little bit further back, play the long game, because Sigma isn't really conducive to like extremely close range. Obviously he hurts himself, but he can do just as much, if not more value from like a mid range, because he can shoot you and then most people can't shoot him as in terms of like a brawl composition who's just trying to get onto him. You know, when you look at like the composition Boston is playing, who can shoot from long range? Like Valentine and Faith's damage is going to be basically negligible. So that's a little bit interesting as to why Paris decided to bunker up right here, particularly. Outside of the fact, like I said, if they were trying to keep like Oni God away from the center of focus, like, oh look, the tanks are in a bad position, let's dive them, and try and take advantage of that while the Widow's on a completely different angle, and just utterly annihilating every single dive because free damage, that's really hard to do. And now you can see this time around, they're sort of respecting Oni God's reach sightlines. Really, they even sent Valentine on a one-man mission to try and deal with this, and I believe he dies. Naga gets a duplicate off. Oni God gets a ridiculous amount of peel, but I mean, why not? Why wouldn't you? And then, you know, it's another successful fight for Paris, where they really only needed to use, what, one ultimate? That was a really close shot. Almost got it. And then having the sights is going to make it that much more difficult for anyone to really deal with Oni God. At this point, now, because the fights have just been so one-sided on this defense for Paris, it's really difficult for Boston to decide, okay, well, who do they engage on? What I personally would believe to be the better option would be to just hard focus the Coalescence onto Naga, take out that burst damage, and then focus down the tanks, all the while trying to respect Oni God sightlines, which sounds like an extremely convoluted plan, because it really is, but that's one of the only ways you're going to deal with it. Like here you have Valentine getting staggered, yeah. I believe Faith died like really early and came back into the fight or something. Or no, I think it was Myunbong who died mid-coalescence because they were trying to focus down the tank line. Like if I go back and show Boston's perspective of this entire fight, let's just go back. Yeah. So here they're posturing. You're going to see like they pop coalescence. They immediately go on, I believe, Vestola, which isn't a terrible dive target. However, in like, say in the mirror composition, oftentimes you'll see the coalescence hard focus down the echo, and there's a considerable amount more peel in this double shield for Naga, because they have the Mercy Pocket in particular, they have the Baptiste if they really wanted to commit Lamp. So like Naga could just run back to the tanks, plop Lamp down, and you're good for a few more seconds. And give Oni God a few more seconds to get picks here or there. See the posturing. Let's slow this down just to see everything from the uprising. So they use Coalescence almost immediately. Yeah, they're focusing down Vestola, which isn't terrible. Like, the off-tank is an extremely valuable target. They use Lamp for him, but in the meantime, you have Bongo and a Mercy-pocketed Naga just, like, going ham into this tiny little room. And that was probably one of the Uprising's bigger mistakes here, is allowing themselves to go into this tiny little room. Vestola doesn't give a shit that he died, because he funneled them exactly where the rest of Paris wanted them to be. And it doesn't really matter, like, all these little picks. Like, it does favor the Uprising in this upcoming fight, as well as the fact that they had to use, what, 4 ultimates that fight? Well, granted, Oni God's sights came, like, pre-fight. But either way, like, again, I think if they had hard-focused Naga, which would have been difficult, because you would have had a lot less damage straight onto him, but you would have had like a little bit of spread from IM-37, you would have had a lot of damage from Valentine, and a decent amount of damage from Gabolshi on top of whatever damage the Coalescence would get. I think Naga would have melted instantaneously. That sounded like it peaked on the mic. But I don't know, we'll figure that out. And I believe this is probably the fight that Boston actually win this, but not with a great time bang. It is probably rather long, because Double Shield's really good at stalling out. Who knew? Immediately Naga uses the duplicate, because they don't really have too many ultimates to deal with otherwise. Yeah, it just gets completely destroyed, somehow gets out. No real long range. Vestola uses Flux, there's Beat, IM-37 using that. You can see just how costly this entire fight was for Boston. They used both DPS ultimates, Beat as well as Primal, and they've just now taken their first tick. Granted, I think a lot of these struggles, I think this past weekend for Boston were self-inflicted, because obviously they came out and looked really dominant on the double shield and the double bubble in 2 weeks ago, last week. I don't know. Whenever they played and went to the first week of the June Joust that they actually played. I think it was the second week of the qualifiers. And then coming into this like rush meta, they just kind of seemed to have a surface level knowledge of it and kind of lacked the fundamentals. I think it was Sideshow who said they have a very like one-dimensional take on it, and I think that's very true. Unfortunately, a little bit of a shadow of like, past seasons of Boston, which isn't great. Like they played definitely considerably better, and they are considerably better players than like past seasons, but they also have this problem of like fundamentals, which again, in like season 1, I think it was Huck, when he was like, the end all be all of anything that happened with Boston. He's like, oh, big focus on the fundamentals, but I have to wonder like what fundamentals are they focusing on, because that's precisely what they lack. They're very talented, but like this past weekend showed that Boston very much lacks the fundamentals to play at like a higher level, right? It's they understand the basics, but they don't have like an intermediate or even an advanced understanding of like their win conditions, how to play them, based off of like something other than a mirror composition, because they looked pretty decent whenever they forced like Paris, for example, to play this. Those are generally the two maps that they won. But when Paris would play literally anything else, and I think this is Volskaya, this map was the start of that, when they played the Roadhog composition, Boston just kind of crumbled apart. And that kind of happened the same with the Gladiators, where they really just had to put like Kevstar in and on like some random off pick, and Boston just crumbled. And then kind of the same thing with Atlanta, where like Atlanta just played the double shield really well. I mean, like, when you look at this, Paris doesn't give a shit about winning this fight. Their entire purpose is to just stall for as long as possible. They gave up 2 ticks because they had to. But otherwise, they're sitting pretty. I mean, obviously they already have like 5 times the time bank. But at the same time, like, they would really love to hold this last tick, bring it to overtime, and then win a singular fight. Because that's all they have to do, is stall until overtime, which is only 1 minute and 20 seconds. And then win a singular fight from there. So they can play this stall really carefully. They don't need to over-invest. They can use the Bongo right now. After that's done, they can use Doritro's Rally. After that's done, they can use Khan's Window and just stagger everything out. They're going to have to be weary of Boston slowly feeding up an advantage. And I do like this small, soft reset from Boston, where they just kind of like take their time into that tiny little room, come back over here. Maybe not the best rotation. I guess taking control of the Mega Health Pack is great, but like, at the same time, you kind of have to get on point, because if you get into overtime and you do cap both points, that's pretty bad, considering Paris would have more time than the first round to actually take a singular tick, as opposed to the entire map that time around. And here you just have Boston, like, I know the title and all that was like, oh, Paris, but it's like at this point they're just kind of like playing their basic win conditions. And I want to go back to like when Boston first engaged. Yeah, they'll rotate around a little bit. I'll slow it down and just show like, okay, so let's see. They're about to burst out of the room right now. Realistically, if I were like casting a lower level game, right? If this was like a community game, ignoring that these are the pros, looking at like the context of this situation, they have 2 ticks, they have about a minute left, they have a decent amount of ultimates, and not too much to work with on the side of the Eternal. Take a little bit of poke damage, take like 15 seconds extra, build up beat, engage with beat, rush in, and just melt whoever's on point, which in this case would be Vestola. Just like stun the shit out of him. Go from there. I am 37, probably teleport up here, although I guess be careful about that depending on who else is up here at the time, because you can just get whip-shotted off. Maybe even teleport over here, because you can't do too much about that. Try and force them down over here so that there's an easier way to poke. Save Death Blossom until at the very least you have Lamp and Shield Bash gone. Granted, these two are going to be holding on to those cooldowns in tandem, to make sure that they have something to do with the Death Blossom, because they more than likely know. And then from there, it's really just going to be on Valentine to build up the duplicate and then try to make something out of the duplicate. Probably look for like a Diva Bomb if they can. If not, if not, like assuming when they burst out of the room and take down Vestola, maybe look for like a Baptiste, or maybe even like the Brig. It's not great, but like the tiny bit of extra healing is going to make it that much harder to accomplish anything for the defense. And that would probably be their best option. Instead, let's see what happens. So Boston dives the high ground, goes for the supports. When they had initially scouted, they didn't see Don because he was rotating. I don't even know where Valentine is. I think he just went up here and only got dicked on him. So they invested cooldowns to get up to the high ground. Vestola just booped them off pretty easy. Faith used beats. IM37 tried to save the day with Death Blossom, but literally every cooldown in the sun was there because you see he took out the lamp, but then he also got Brig bashed. So he got quite literally nothing with his Death Blossom. And all you have now are Duplicate, Bomb, and Primal Rage, which Primal Rage is more just going to be to... Actually, no, Gabelshi doesn't have Bomb. That was just a remake. Right. So they only have Duplicate and Primal Rage, and like I said, Primal Rage isn't really going to be the best ultimate. It's literally just going to be to allow Stand 1 to get in a little bit deeper and get out with his life. Which in this case, it doesn't matter. Because they have one fight remaining, and I'm like almost positive, yeah, that they don't capture it. And they had this problem like the entire weekend, especially on 2CP, where they would just get like utterly fucking rolled and then come back and like do decent in terms of performance, but just like lack that closing power. And then from here for the Paris Eternal, like looking at what they have Window. They're going to have both DPS ultimates. Vestola's going to have Bomb. And they already forced, what, like 2-3 ultimates out of Boston, like the previous fight? They're sitting pretty. They're already in overtime. At this point, Paris doesn't really care if Boston takes the point, because they're already in a win or draw scenario where they have 5 minutes. Granted, they do want to end it now, just because why the hell not? And they have the spawn advantage, so because the fight was going back and forth the entire time, Paris had the inherent advantage. Just because they were going to get back quicker than Boston. That was the exact inverse of the first point, where Boston would have had an advantage if it was a staggered fight, because Paris would have gotten back a lot later. So yeah, I guess in terms of like answering the question posed in the title of this video, did Paris break the meta? Not really. No, they just played their win conditions really well. They played unorthodox compositions into a team that maybe they didn't completely realize, but they soon found out was not particularly adaptable. Like, Boston really struggled with adapting to anything that wasn't like what they believed to be the bog standard meta. And even in like Double Shield was meta, and Boston themselves were playing it for their first weekend of the June Joust, and they just seemed completely uncomfortable trying to play into that with their Winston Rush. I almost would have liked to see them try more of the Double Shield, because I believe they played it up against like Washington a good amount of the Double Shield, and they actually performed really well. So it was kind of weird to see them like force the rush when it just wasn't working. I mean, I guess like at that level you kind of have to stick with the plan, but I don't know. It's just a lot of fundamental mistakes of like not playing win conditions, not taking the easy route in terms of like who to focus and how to approach any fight, and they just didn't play the clock well. They didn't understand how to shut down compositions. I mean, like when you look at Paris's first attack, where they played like Roadhog Diva, that composition is rather easy to shut down, because it's, like I pointed out earlier, it's very high risk, high reward. It's very dependent on the team playing the Roadhog to create openings and the DPS to find these lucky picks. So all you have to do is play a little bit more passive and punish them when they don't have cooldowns. That's it. And instead, they just kind of like played directly into Paris's hand and got completely rolled this map. I believe they come back and like take the next map, and then it goes back and forth to Paris again, and then it goes to Paris in the final map, and they end up losing. So yeah, again, just more Paris playing their win conditions in an unorthodox composition better. Not so much Paris having unlocked the secrets of the meta. Personally, I'm hoping for, I believe the next month for July is like the Summer Showdown, I think they're calling it. I believe and hope that there's not going to be any hero pools, because personally the meta is a lot more stale right now with hero pools. It didn't help that the meta was extremely diverse and really interesting during the May Melee without hero pools, so it really doesn't help by comparison that like the June Joust became literally either double shield or this Winston Rush composition that kind of replaced double bubble. So yeah, I forget if the Hawaii games this upcoming weekend will have hero pools or not. Doesn't really matter. Probably going to be playing similar compositions either way, although having Reinhardt back in the mix personally would be really fun to watch. Anyways, though, I hope you enjoyed this analysis. A little bit lengthy, but I guess I'm shooting for that now. It's just one of these videos a week, and I found this topic to be rather interesting. That was the only team I've seen trying to run a Roadhog composition like that throughout the entirety of June Joust. So if you did enjoy this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more like it, maybe even subscribe. I do these usually every Wednesday, so be looking forward to that. And that's all I've really got. So until next Wednesday, don't die.